Throughout the Northwest European Campaign from June 1944 to May 1945, American intelligence officers conducted thousands of prisoner-of-war interrogations that revealed a striking pattern. When German soldiers were asked what weapon they feared most on the battlefield, the overwhelming answer was not American tanks, not American fighter planes, but American artillery. This fear was not merely words spoken in interrogation rooms. It was reflected in the tactical behavior of German units across the entire theater. German soldiers had learned through bitter experience that American artillery represented a threat unlike any other weapon system. The interrogation reports, preserved in National Archives records, show this pattern repeated consistently throughout the campaign. German prisoners captured from France in June through August 1944 frequently mentioned American artillery as the most terrifying weapon they had encountered. Officers and enlisted men alike described the distinctive sound of American gunfire that arrived without warning, without ranging shots, and without time to take cover. One Wehrmacht soldier captured near St. Lo in July 1944 told interrogators that American artillery felt like fighting an enemy who could see everything and shoot at everything simultaneously. This soldier's words captured the essence of what made American artillery so feared. German units had developed elaborate procedures specifically designed to avoid American artillery observation. They moved primarily at night, when observation aircraft could not detect them. They dispersed their forces to avoid presenting concentrated targets. They limited their own artillery activity to brief missions, followed by immediate displacement from their positions. The psychological impact of this fear cannot be understated. German soldiers learned to recognize the distinctive high-pitched engine sound of the American L-4 Cub observation aircraft and would immediately take cover when they heard it overhead. German artillery was not inferior in terms of equipment and firepower. The German 105 mm and 155 mm artillery pieces were excellent weapons that compared favorably, or were even superior to, American guns in terms of range and destructive power. The problem was not with the hardware itself. The difference lay entirely in how American artillery operated as a comprehensive system. German artillery operated primarily at the battery level, with individual battery commanders controlling their own guns and computing their own firing data. This decentralized approach meant that massing fire from multiple batteries required elaborate pre-planning and was rarely achieved against targets of opportunity that appeared suddenly on the battlefield. When a German artillery battery received a fire mission, the process of computing firing data was lengthy and complex. Calculations required for determining elevation, deflection, and charge settings for each gun had to be done individually using range tables, protractors, and slide rules. Every variable, including wind speed and barrel wear, had to be factored separately into the calculations. Under normal conditions, this process required 12 to 15 minutes. Under combat conditions where meteorological data was incomplete or communications were disrupted, the process could take 20 minutes or longer. The calculations were complex enough that they typically required trained officers to complete accurately. The German gunners were skilled professionals who understood their craft thoroughly. However, the fundamental limitation of their system was that it could not respond quickly to targets of opportunity. German artillery commanders recognized that American artillery was different, but the exact nature of the American advantage remained unclear to them initially. German artillery officers were shocked by the speed at which American artillery could respond to calls for fire. The idea that Americans could receive target coordinates, compute firing data from multiple batteries simultaneously, coordinate simultaneous impact of shells, and execute the entire fire mission in just 3 minutes seemed impossible to German officers who understood the complexities of artillery mathematics. The explanation for American artillery superiority lay in an innovation developed at the United States Army Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, during the interwar period. This innovation was called the Fire Direction Center, and it fundamentally changed how artillery could be coordinated and controlled in combat. The concept emerged from careful analysis of World War I artillery operations by American officers studying the Great War. These officers recognized that artillery had been the most decisive weapon in World War I, causing more casualties than any other weapon. However, they also recognized profound inefficiency in how artillery was employed. Massive expenditures of ammunition produced limited results relative to the quantities fired. The problem was not with the guns themselves, which were reasonably effective weapons. The fundamental problem was coordination and fire control. This realization led to a systematic effort to improve artillery operations. Major Carlos Brewer, serving as director of the gunnery department at Fort Sill from 1929 through 1933, began developing solutions to these problems. Brewer introduced a firing chart system that simplified target location and improved coordination between batteries. Instead of each battery computing every element from scratch, batteries could plot their position and target position on standardized charts overlaid with reference data. These charts made it easier to visualize spatial relationships between guns and targets and simplified communication of firing data between units. Brewer also developed survey procedures that allowed batteries to know their precise location, eliminating one major source of aiming error that had plagued artillery operations previously. However, Brewer could not solve the fundamental problem of firing data computation. Even with improved charts and survey techniques, the mathematical calculations required to convert target coordinates into gun settings remained complex and time-consuming. A breakthrough in this challenge required a different approach to the entire problem of how artillery units should be organized and controlled. The breakthrough came under Brewer's successor, Major Orlando Ward, who served as director of the gunnery department from 1932 through 1934. Ward developed the revolutionary concept of centralized fire direction at the battalion level. Instead of each battery commander independently computing firing data for his own guns, Ward created a battalion fire direction center that would control all guns in the battalion simultaneously. This fire direction center would receive fire missions from forward observers, compute the required firing data, and transmit the gun settings to all batteries. This centralization enabled true massing of fires for the first time. Multiple batteries could engage the same target with minimal delay, and fire could be shifted rapidly from one target to another as the tactical situation changed. The concept was so promising that it was demonstrated publicly in the spring of 1931. The gunnery department successfully massed battalion fire using centralized fire direction, showing that multiple batteries could be coordinated to deliver simultaneous fire on a single target. The demonstration impressed visiting officers and validated Ward's theoretical concept. Word of this successful demonstration spread through military circles, and the concept received support from senior artillery leadership. Over the next decade following this demonstration, fire direction center procedures were refined and standardized through extensive practice exercises. By the time the United States entered World War II, battalion-level fire direction centers had become standard doctrine throughout the entire field artillery branch. The Army had made this system a core part of how artillery would operate in future conflicts. However, even with centralized control established, the system still required complex mathematical calculations to determine firing data. Fire direction officers spent years learning to use tabular firing tables, which were voluminous books that listed firing data for thousands of possible combinations of range, meteorological conditions, and projectile characteristics. Finding the correct data in these tables was time-consuming, and interpolating between listed values required considerable mathematical skill. The system worked effectively, but it remained slow compared to what it might be if calculation could be simplified. The final breakthrough in the American artillery system came in November 1940 when Captain Abbott Harrington Burns, serving at Fort Sill, invented the graphical firing table. Burns created this device literally overnight, working through the entire night to develop a solution to what he called the slow torture of intricate mathematics. The graphical firing table was essentially a specialized slide rule printed on a transparent sheet of material. Fire direction officers could lay this sheet directly on their firing chart, align it with the battery and target positions shown on the map, and read the required firing data directly without performing any mathematical calculations. The device made computation more than 20 times faster than the previous tabular method. More importantly, it allowed enlisted soldiers with only basic arithmetic skills to perform calculations that previously required trained officers to complete. This democratization of the calculation process meant that fire direction centers could operate effectively even when senior officers were not available. The graphical firing table revolutionized American artillery operations. By 1942, when American forces entered combat in North Africa, every artillery battalion had fire direction centers equipped with graphical firing tables. The combination of centralized control through the battalion fire direction center and rapid computation through graphical firing tables created the 3-minute response time that so shocked German opponents. An artillery observer could call in target coordinates to the fire direction center. The fire direction center could compute and distribute the required firing data to multiple batteries, and multiple batteries could be shooting within 3 minutes. No other army in World War II could match that speed of response. This capability gave American artillery a fundamental advantage that compounded over time as more targets could be engaged and more missions could be executed. The speed and coordinating capability of American artillery enabled something the Americans called time-on-target missions. In a time-on-target mission, guns from multiple batteries spread across several kilometers would fire at carefully calculated different times. The firing times were calculated so precisely that all shells arrived over the target within a narrow 3-second window. The effect of this tactic was absolutely devastating to German forces. Instead of shells arriving sequentially, which gave soldiers time to take cover after the first explosions, every round impacted simultaneously. The entire bombardment occurred in an instant before anyone could react or take shelter. Most casualties in artillery bombardments occur during the first few seconds before troops can go prone or find adequate cover. Time-on-target missions maximized casualties by compressing the entire fire mission into those critical first seconds. The German artillery system could not execute time-on-target missions against targets of opportunity. The coordination required between different batteries was beyond the capability of their decentralized battery-level fire control system. Germans could execute simultaneous fires if they had days to prepare, carefully surveying all positions and pre-computing all firing data in advance. However, they could not do it on 3 minutes' notice against an unexpected target that appeared suddenly during combat operations. British artillery was more sophisticated than German artillery in many respects. British artillery had excellent training and equipment. British artillery officers developed elaborate fire planning procedures that allowed impressive concentrations of fire. By 1941, Brigadier Jack Parham had demonstrated the ability to coordinate 144 guns in a divisional concentration delivered within 5 minutes of the fire call. British artillery used a system of standardized concentrations they called Mike, Uncle, Victor, and William targets, with each designation representing a different scale of mass fire. However, British procedures were fundamentally different from American time-on-target techniques in important ways. British concentrations achieved rapid massing of fire, but did not emphasize simultaneous impact the way American procedures did. British doctrine accepted shells arriving over a short time period rather than insisting on the 3-second window that Americans achieved through their carefully calculated time-on-target missions. The difference between British and American approaches was subtle but significant in terms of casualty effectiveness. When shells arrived sequentially rather than simultaneously, defending troops had brief moments to seek better shelter and take additional protective actions. When shells all arrived within 3 seconds, defenders could not move effectively or take additional cover. Soviet artillery operated on a completely different philosophy than either American or British artillery. The Red Army possessed enormous numbers of guns and used them for massive preparatory bombardments that lasted hours and consumed staggering quantities of ammunition. At Kursk in July 1943, Soviet artillery fired over 1.6 million shells in the opening bombardment alone. The sheer volume of fire was devastating and played a crucial role in breaking German attacks, but Soviet fire control remained relatively primitive throughout the war. Soviet batteries typically fired at area targets or pre-plotted coordinates without the precise adjustment that characterized American artillery operations. Russian shells often landed scattered across hundreds of meters, and instances of friendly fire from inaccurate artillery were not uncommon in Soviet operations. Soviet doctrine emphasized overwhelming firepower through quantity rather than precision and accuracy. The approach was effective in the massive battles of the Eastern Front, where targets were often large concentrations of troops and vehicles. However, it lacked the flexibility and precision of the American system. The American approach to artillery was based entirely on flexibility and responsiveness to changing situations. This American approach was enabled by an extensive forward observer system that no other army in World War II matched in scope or effectiveness. American doctrine placed trained artillery observers at company level and below in infantry and armored units. These observers had direct radio communication with battalion fire direction centers and could call for fire on any target they identified. The observers were not simply spotters who reported target locations. They were trained artillery officers or non-commissioned officers who understood fire direction procedures and could work directly with fire direction centers to adjust fire and maximize effectiveness. Each American artillery battalion maintained a liaison section that provided forward observers to supported units. For a battalion supporting an infantry regiment, liaison officers would typically be assigned to each infantry battalion, with additional observers assigned down to company level as needed. The observers carried powerful radios that maintained reliable communication with fire direction centers, even in difficult terrain or under intense combat conditions. The SCR-610 radio, which became standard for forward observers in 1943, had a range of approximately 20 miles and was reliable enough that observers could maintain contact even when infantry units were cut off or surrounded. Forward observers were trained to locate targets accurately using maps and visual estimation techniques. They carried plotting boards, compasses, and binoculars for this purpose. A trained observer could estimate range to a target within 50 meters at distances up to 2,000 meters, which was sufficient accuracy for fire direction centers to compute effective firing data. The observers were also trained in adjustment procedures, calling corrections to walk artillery fire onto targets that were initially missed. The standard adjustment procedure used the clock system to describe target location relative to the impact of previous rounds fired. An observer might report that a target was at the 12:00 clock position and 200 meters from the last impact, and the fire direction center would adjust fire accordingly. But the real revolution in forward observation came with the L-4 Cub aircraft. The L-4 was a military version of the Piper J-3 Cub, a small commercial aircraft that had been adapted for military use. The military version was modified with larger tires for rough field operations, a transparent window in the roof for upward visibility, and radios for communication with ground units. The aircraft was powered by a 65-horsepower engine and had a maximum speed of 85 miles per hour. It could take off and land in incredibly short distances, typically less than 300 feet, allowing it to operate from rough forward airstrips close to the front lines. The Army Air Forces had initially resisted organic aviation for the artillery, arguing that all aviation assets should be controlled by the air forces. But artillery officers argued that effective fire control required observers who understood artillery procedures and who were directly integrated into artillery command structures. After considerable bureaucratic conflict, the War Department approved organic field artillery aviation in 1942. Each artillery battalion received 2 L-4 aircraft and trained pilots who were artillery officers themselves. The L-4 South transformed artillery effectiveness dramatically. From an altitude of 1,000 to 1,500 feet, an aerial observer could see terrain for miles in every direction. Targets that would be completely invisible to ground observers became visible from the air. Units positioned in defilade behind hills, artillery positions hidden in tree lines, supply convoys moving on roads behind enemy lines, all were visible from the air. The aerial observer could identify targets, estimate their coordinates using maps and visual reference points, and call for fire directly to the Fire Direction Center. More than 5,400 L-4 aircraft were produced during the war, and more than 2,700 served with field artillery units in Europe. The presence of an L-4 overhead became a signature indicator that American artillery was active in the area and prepared to engage targets. German soldiers learned to recognize the distinctive sound of the Cub's small engine and would immediately take cover when they heard it overhead. They understood from bitter experience what that sound meant. German tactical manuals from late 1944 included specific instructions for what to do when L-4 aircraft appeared. Units were ordered to cease movement, disperse to maximum extent possible, and take cover immediately. The Germans understood that once the Cub spotted them, artillery fire would follow within minutes. German attempts to shoot down the L-4 South were generally unsuccessful despite considerable effort. The small aircraft flew low and slow, making them difficult targets for anti-aircraft guns designed to engage fast-moving fighters and bombers at altitude. The L-4S were agile enough that pilots could see anti-aircraft fire and take evasive action. German fighters could catch the L-4 South easily in terms of speed, but fighter patrols in forward areas were dangerous due to American air superiority. German fighters tasked with intercepting Cubs often found themselves engaged by American fighter escorts. Many L-4 pilots flew their entire combat tours without being shot down, despite operating constantly over enemy territory throughout the campaign. The L-4 pilots developed close working relationships with the fire direction centers they supported. A battalion aerial observer might fly daily missions with the same fire direction officer, and the team would develop efficient communication procedures. The observer could describe targets in shorthand that the fire direction officer understood immediately without requiring lengthy explanations. The speed and accuracy of this coordination was extraordinary. An experienced aerial observer team could identify a target, call for fire, and have shells landing within 2 to 3 minutes. The observer would then adjust fire if needed, often achieving direct hits on small targets like individual vehicles or single artillery pieces. The psychological effect of the L-4S on German forces cannot be overstated. The constant presence of American observation aircraft meant German units could never feel safe, even in rear areas far from the front lines. Supply convoys had to move at night or risk being spotted and destroyed. Artillery batteries had to remain under cover during daylight hours. Reserve units could not assemble in obvious locations. The L-4 South forced German forces into a state of constant vigilance and limited their operational freedom during daylight hours significantly. The integration of aerial observation with the Fire Direction Center system created a level of battlefield awareness that was unprecedented in military history. Fire Direction Centers maintained detailed maps showing friendly unit positions, known enemy positions, suspected enemy locations, and no fire areas where friendly forces might be present. When an aerial observer reported a target, the Fire Direction Center could immediately evaluate whether the target was in a safe area for engagement, which batteries were in range, and how much fire was appropriate for the target type. The entire decision cycle from target identification to rounds on target could be completed in under 3 minutes for urgent targets. This flexibility was revolutionary. German doctrine assigned specific batteries to support specific units in rigid command relationships. A German infantry battalion might have a designated artillery battery in direct support, and that battery would fire missions for that battalion alone. But if the battalion needed more fire than one battery could provide, requesting additional support required coordination through higher headquarters, a time-consuming process. American forward observers could request fire from any battery in range, and the Fire Direction Center could mass fires from an entire corps' artillery if the target warranted it. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, noted in his post-war memoir that the Fire Direction Center system allowed extraordinary concentrations of fire. During the Battle of the Bulge, artillery on the northern shoulder of the German penetration coordinated fire from 348 guns belonging to different divisions and corps. The guns were spread across dozens of kilometers, belonged to different units, but were all controlled through coordinated fire direction centers and could mass their fire on critical targets within minutes. The effectiveness of American artillery is documented in numerous battle accounts. At the Battle of Morton in early August 1944, German forces launched Operation Lueck, a desperate counterattack attempting to cut off American forces that had broken out of Normandy. The attack began before dawn on August 7th, with German armor and infantry advancing rapidly in the pre-dawn darkness when American air superiority could not intervene. German commanders hoped to reach Avranches on the coast, cutting off Lieutenant General George Patton's Third Army forces that had broken through into Brittany. The German attack initially made progress against surprised American units. But as daylight came, American artillery observers in L-4 Cubs took to the air and began directing devastating fire onto German columns. The 230th Field Artillery Battalion, supporting the 30th Infantry Division, fired thousands of rounds throughout the day. Individual batteries fired so continuously that gun barrels overheated and had to be allowed to cool before resuming fire. Ammunition stocks were depleted, and resupply trucks ran constantly between ammunition dumps and gun positions. The artillery fire was so accurate and so intense that German tank commanders reported being unable to maneuver. Every time German tanks attempted to advance or reposition, artillery fire would land precisely on their location within minutes. The combination of American artillery and fighter-bomber attacks, both directed by aerial observers who could see the entire battlefield, stopped the German offensive cold. By August 8th, it was clear the attack had failed completely. By August 10th, German forces were retreating, and what had been intended as a decisive counteroffensive had become a disaster as Allied forces encircled and destroyed much of the German 7th Army. Lieutenant Ralph Curley, commander of E Company, 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment, 30th Infantry Division, directed artillery fire onto his own position when German forces attacked Hill 314 near Mortain. When the German 17th Panzer Grenadier Division assaulted E Company's perimeter just after 8 in the evening on August 7th, Curley called for artillery fire danger close to his own location. 84 howitzers delivered a devastating 5-minute barrage that broke the German attack. American soldiers found whatever cover they could find to survive the friendly fire, while German attackers were unable to withstand the onslaught and retreated in disorder. Curley's willingness to accept artillery fire on his own position exemplified both the desperate nature of the fighting and the trust American forces had in their artillery systems, precision and reliability. The fighting for Hill 192 near St. Lo in July 1944 showed similar artillery dominance. Hill 192 was a key terrain feature that dominated the approaches to St. Lo. German forces had fortified the hill with extensive trench systems, bunkers, and carefully sited weapons positions. American forces had attacked the hill repeatedly in late June and early July with limited success. German defenders had excellent fields of fire and could engage attacking American infantry at long range. The 2nd Infantry Division, tasked with capturing the hill, planned a deliberate attack supported by massive artillery preparation. Division artillery included 3 battalions of 105 mm howitzers and 1 battalion of 155 mm howitzers, a total of 48 guns. But the Fire Direction Center was able to call on additional support from Corps artillery, bringing the total available firepower to more than 100 guns for the operation. The attack began on July 11, 1944, after several days of careful preparation. American artillery fired 20 times on target missions during the night of July 10th to July 11th, each mission bringing mass fire from dozens of guns onto German defensive positions. The time on target missions were timed to prevent German defenders from resting or reorganizing during the night. Every hour or two throughout the night, another massive bombardment would hit the German positions, preventing sleep and maintaining constant stress on the defenders throughout the darkness. On July 11th, the main attack began with a thunderous artillery preparation. The 2nd Infantry Division's artillery fired 20,000 rounds that day alone, an average of more than 800 rounds per gun. The bombardment was so intense that German survivors reported complete disruption of command and control. Telephone lines were cut by the shelling. Runners could not move between positions, and commanders lost contact with their subordinate units. When American infantry finally advanced behind the artillery preparation, German resistance was disorganized and ineffective. Hill 192 was captured by early afternoon on July 11th, without excessive casualties to the American attackers. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 to January 1945 provided another dramatic demonstration of American artillery effectiveness. When German forces launched their surprise offensive on December 16th, they achieved tactical surprise and made significant initial gains. But American artillery recovered from the initial shock within hours and began delivering coordinated fire across the entire front. On the northern shoulder of the German penetration near Elsenborn Ridge, American artillery played the decisive role in stopping German attacks. The 1st Infantry Division and supporting units were backed by massed artillery that included divisional artillery, Corps artillery, and even artillery from adjacent sectors that could range into the threatened area. The Fire Direction Center's coordinated fire from 348 guns belonging to multiple divisions and corps spread across dozens of kilometers. This concentration of firepower, controlled through coordinated fire direction, was possible only because of the American system. No other army could have rapidly organized such massive fire support. German infantry and armor attacking toward Elsenborn Ridge encountered devastating artillery fire that broke up every attack. German commanders reported that American artillery fire was so intense and so accurate that German forces could not maintain their attacks. Units that attempted to advance were hit by time on target missions that landed with no warning. Units that attempted to regroup in assembly areas found themselves under fire within minutes. The combination of accurate fire and rapid response made German offensive operations impossible. The 6th Panzer Army, the main German striking force in the northern sector, was stopped almost entirely by American artillery. German tank losses to artillery fire were so heavy that several panzer divisions reported losing more than half their armor to artillery bombardment. The German official history of the battle, compiled after the war, attributed the failure of the northern attack primarily to American artillery rather than to American armor or air power. In the southern sector of the Bulge at Bastogne, American artillery again played the critical role in defense. The 101st Airborne Division, surrounded in Bastogne, was supported by artillery battalions that remained inside the pocket and by artillery firing from outside the encirclement. Forward observers with the paratroopers called for fire constantly, and fire direction centers coordinated responses from any guns that could range into the needed areas. German forces attacking Bastogne encountered the same pattern seen elsewhere during the Bulge. Advancing troops were hit by accurate massed artillery fire that arrived with devastating speed. German commanders reported being unable to concentrate forces for attacks because any concentration would immediately draw American artillery fire. German attempts to respond with counterfire were increasingly futile as the campaign progressed. American artillery had developed sophisticated counter-battery procedures that integrated multiple intelligence sources. Sound-ranging units used sensitive microphones to triangulate the source of enemy gunfire. Flash spotting posts used surveyed observation positions to plot the location of muzzle flashes at night. Aerial observers in L-4 Cubs and fighter bombers reported any visible artillery positions. Prisoner interrogations provided information about unit locations and artillery positions. All of this intelligence flowed into fire direction centers that maintained detailed maps of known and suspected German artillery positions. When German guns fired, American intelligence systems detected them within seconds. The coordinates went immediately to counter-battery fire direction centers with highest priority. American doctrine called for immediate suppressive fire on any identified enemy artillery. German batteries firing more than a few rounds could expect American counterfire within 3 to 5 minutes. The result was steady degradation of German artillery effectiveness. Wehrmacht batteries that revealed their positions by firing would be suppressed or destroyed. German artillery officers learned to fire brief missions and immediately displace, hoping to escape before counterfire arrived. But displacement was time-consuming, especially for horse-drawn artillery, which still comprised the majority of German guns. Many batteries were caught and destroyed during displacement. Others avoided destruction only by severely limiting their activity, firing only a few rounds per day, and only when the tactical situation was desperate. The ammunition situation made German problems worse considerably. By mid-1944, Allied air interdiction had devastated German logistics. Convoys and railroads were under constant attack. Ammunition production was declining as strategic bombing damaged factories and disrupted raw material supplies. German artillery batteries in Normandy operated under severe ammunition rationing. The Army Historical Foundation documents that German 5th Panzer Army artillery supporting operations in Normandy could fire only about 10% of the ammunition volume that British artillery fired in the same sector. The disparity was not due to fewer guns, but to critical lack of ammunition. German mobility was also inferior to American mobility, and this disparity became more pronounced as the war continued. American artillery was completely motorized from the beginning of American involvement in the war. Every gun was towed by a truck or mounted on a self-propelled chassis. The standard prime mover for the 105 mm M2A1 howitzer was the 2.5-ton 6x6 truck commonly called the Deuce and a Half. These trucks could tow the howitzer at speeds up to 40 miles per hour on roads and could traverse rough terrain that would have been impossible for horse-drawn artillery. Heavier guns required more powerful prime movers. The 155 mm M1 howitzer was typically towed by the M5 high-speed tractor, a tracked vehicle specifically designed for artillery towing. The M5 could move the heavy howitzer across virtually any terrain and could tow at speeds up to 35 miles per hour on roads. For the heaviest guns, including the 155 mm M1917A1 gun, known as the Long Tom, and the 8-inch howitzer, the Army used the M4 high-speed tractor, an even more powerful tracked vehicle. American self-propelled artillery provided even greater mobility. The M7 Priest, mounting a 105 mm howitzer on an M3 or M4 tank chassis, was the primary self-propelled artillery for armored divisions. Each armored division had 3 battalions of M7 priests, a total of 54 howitzers that could move and fight with the division's tanks. The M7 could travel at road speeds up to 25 miles per hour and could traverse any terrain that tanks could cross. The crew could fire from the vehicle, and the M7 could displace under fire and continue firing from moving positions if necessary. The M12 gun motor carriage mounted a 155 mm gun on a modified M3 tank chassis. Only 100 units were built initially, with 74 refurbished for the Normandy campaign. The M12 served as a bunker buster, capable of direct fire against fortified positions. During operations against the Siegfried Line fortifications in autumn 1944, M12 units were used to engage German bunkers with direct fire, penetrating 7 feet of reinforced concrete. The mobility of the M12 allowed these heavy guns to be brought forward quickly to engage targets that would have required days to reach with towed artillery. German artillery, in contrast, remained largely horse-drawn throughout the war. Germany mobilized approximately 2.75 million horses during World War II, and each infantry division used roughly 5,300 horses for artillery and logistics. A German artillery battery typically required 150 to 200 horses to move its 4 to 6 guns, plus ammunition and support equipment. The horses required constant care, feeding, and rest. Each horse needed approximately 20 pounds of fodder per day, and providing this fodder in combat zones required substantial logistics effort. Horse-drawn artillery could move at most 25 kilometers per day under favorable conditions. In rain or mud, movement could be reduced to 10 kilometers per day or less. Hitching horses to guns, moving the battery, and unlimbing at a new position required 2 to 3 hours under good conditions. Under combat conditions with enemy fire or poor visibility, the process could take much longer. The disparity between American motorized artillery that could displace in 15 minutes and move 50 kilometers in an hour versus German horse-drawn artillery that needed hours to move and could travel only limited distances per day was absolutely decisive in determining artillery effectiveness. The horse dependence created other severe vulnerabilities for German forces. Horses were vulnerable to artillery fire, air attack, and disease. A battery that lost significant numbers of horses to enemy action might be immobilized for days until replacement horses could be brought forward from rear areas. Artillery horses also required stable conditions for rest and feeding. Unlike trucks, which could be parked and ignored until needed, horses required constant attention and care. Artillery units had to allocate substantial personnel to horse care, reducing the number of men available for combat duties. The German attempt to mechanize their artillery in 1943 and 1944 came too late and never reached sufficient scale to offset the mobility advantage American forces enjoyed. Some German artillery units received half-track prime movers or captured vehicles, but the majority remained horse-drawn until the end of the war. The American artillery system was not a single invention or a dramatic technological breakthrough. It was the product of systematic institutional development over 2 decades. Officers at Fort Sill had studied World War I, identified problems, developed solutions, tested procedures, and trained thousands of artillery officers in the new doctrine. Every element worked together in harmony. Remove any single element, and the system would degrade significantly. But with all elements functioning together, the system delivered precision-coordinated firepower that no other army could match. German soldiers in foxholes facing that system learned to fear the sound of the Piper Cub engine overhead because they knew that sound meant death was 3 minutes away. Wars are won through logistics, training, doctrine, and systematic execution rather than individual acts of heroism. That is the true legacy of American artillery in World War II.